One of you commented a couple of weeks ago, so is this entire class going to be like one Mythbuster after another? And the answer is no, even though I'm sure that you are feeling at least a little bit of skepticism with regard to my truthfulness on that answer. We've talked about the Babylonian context of Genesis 1 through 11. We've talked about the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch and how a lot of scholars don't actually think that's a thing. We've talked about the historicity of the stories of the ancestors, and both I and your readings have maybe landed on some unfamiliar and scary conclusions. And I have another one for you this week in this video regarding the historicity of the Exodus event. And before I get there, I want to remind us of a couple of things. First, remember, we are reading ancient literature, and we are usually bringing very modern conceptions of history writing to the table. But ancient writers, they don't always do things in ways that we expect, which can be difficult for us to identify and also difficult for us to accept. As we've talked about before, we have these commitments that, if challenged, they pose a big problem to our belief system. So I know that we're treading on really sensitive territory here. I'd also add that I hear Esau Macaulay in the back of my mind as well with regard to some of the things that are being challenged. And I want to do right by him. So we'll have these conversations, but I also want to allow people space to maintain the readings, the theological readings in particular, that they have had in the past. Second, or third, in these early stories in the Pentateuch, we're dealing with a dearth of extra-biblical evidence, whether that evidence is archaeological or textual. We don't have a lot of stuff outside of the Bible to affirm the things that are in the Bible. And sometimes what we do have paints a very different picture than the one that's presented in the Bible. That's going to be the case when we talk about Joshua and the Battle of Jericho. But just bear with me. On the archaeological evidence, Bill Arnold, an Old Testament professor at Asbury Seminary, which is a fairly conservative Methodist seminary in Wilmore, Kentucky, he writes this in his introduction to the Old Testament. He says, "When it comes to ancient Near Eastern archaeology, our evidence is largely accidental. By this, I mean that which periods of ancient history are illuminated by our discoveries have been left to chance. We uncover only a tiny fraction of life in those periods," he writes, "and the likelihood of finding confirmation of such ancient traces is minimal. This is especially true of finding evidence of an ancient people group without a national identity, without a homeland, without them being in a settled way of life. Whether we're looking for wandering ancestors living in the northeastern delta of Egypt or wandering pastoral, semi-nomadic tribes in the desert, we're unlikely to ever find," he says, "confirmation of early Israel." This is a really fair way to describe the situation, especially when it comes to the nomadic shepherds of Genesis, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, or when it comes to Israelites wandering in the wilderness after their escape from Egypt. I'm not sure what we would expect to find there. But what about something like the Exodus? In the Bible, this is a monumental event in which the firstborn sons and animals even of the Egyptians die in that 10th climactic plague. We have some 2.5 million people leaving Egyptian slavery, a group roughly the size of Baltimore leaving Egyptian slavery. And then after the Egyptian army gives chase, they're defeated and they suffer a massive defeat in the Red Sea. Is it true that we would be unlikely to ever find confirmation of that sort of event? We're not talking about semi-nomadic people wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. We're not talking about Abraham's family not really leaving a trace of where they're settling. We're talking about this large-scale, massive event as it's depicted in the Bible. Because here's the difficult part. We haven't really found any evidence. There's no archaeological evidence for the Exodus event. If you're flashing back maybe to that documentary that you saw with chariot wheels on the floor of the Red Sea, I don't mean to be the bearer of bad news here, but that ain't it. The same is true for any physical evidence of Noah's Ark or the Ark of the Covenant or Goliath's sword or Goliath's head, whatever it is that people have said they found, the Ten Commandments. They haven't. In most cases, there's no textual mention of the Exodus either outside of the Bible. Now with that one, let's push back and ask the question, should we expect the Egyptians to have mentioned such a devastating event in their records? And that really depends on who you talk to. On the surface, we might be prone to explaining the absence of the Egyptian record of the Exodus event by their own embarrassment of what has happened. You go from the plagues to the Red Sea crossing. They lost. More than that, they were absolutely humiliated. Why would they record such an event for posterity? As one author puts it, Egyptians do not document their crises. Another author, however, Pete Enns, who you read in week 2, I believe, says that line of argument isn't convincing. Ancient kingdoms handled national embarrassments not by ignoring them, but by spinning them. We would expect the Egyptians to say, okay, that was rough, but remember, our gods are still mightier than this no-name god of slaves. The only reason that they bested us was because our gods were mad at us. See, they would spin the account to make a rational explanation as to why 2.5 million people left their oppressive state and fled to freedom. John Collins, in his introduction, which you read, he agrees with this. Perhaps you have already expected this sort of parody after our discussions on the maximalists and the minimalists, and all those occupying the space in between, the large majority of those people in between the maximalist position and the minimalist position. Enns and Collins, by the way, they're actually in between, as we'll see. For the maximalists, their assessment of the lack of archaeological evidence is explained away. For example, Kenneth Kitchen argues, of course there is no evidence for any Hebrews in this area. The climate is not amenable to such evidence lasting centuries, millennia even. And he quotes, "Biblicists must shed their naive attitudes and cease demanding evidence that cannot exist." Kenneth Kitchen is one of the names that you will see in the bibliographies of maximalists. He's an Egyptologist, and he's coming at this from the same place that Albright was, a place of plausibility. Since there is no, and according to Kitchen, cannot be any evidence, the maximalists, they support the historicity of the biblical account by, again, arguing for its plausibility. That's based on comparative evidence. So here are some of the examples. It's stuff like the existence of Semitic slaves was well known and attested in Egypt during the 2nd millennium. So we have textual records of Semitic slaves in Egypt during roughly the same sort of period. That's got some of its own issues, but we'll just leave that off to the side because we've got these slave records. They also argue, them being the maximalists, they argue on the basis of attempted connections with known Egyptian rulers and sites. Note, there's not a lot of characters that are named in the early chapters of this story. Even the Pharaoh that is sort of overseeing this is not named in the story. But you have an early mention of the store city Ramses, and people connect that to Ramses II and try to link the dots to a historical reality in ancient Egypt. The maximalists also read the stories of the plagues in particular as dealing with realia known to exist in and around the Nile, as opposed to mythical creatures. So, flies, gnats, hailstorms, even things like the Nile being turned red. They've attempted to make sense of those things from a phenomenological standpoint. This has also led people to attempting a reconstruction of these events, maybe even finding a time in which they may have occurred. Maximalists also emphasize the prevalence, or at least the occurrence, of exoduses in the ancient world. So if there are Semitic slaves, there's also accounts of slave groups leaving. And if that's the case, perhaps then this story is plausible. Again, for more on this, you can see Kenneth Kitchen's work on the reliability of the Old Testament. Just as we saw with Albright and those in the mid-20th century that were a part of his school, there's no hard evidence here, but there might be plausibility. Minimalists, of course, disagree, and they cite just the lack of evidence to promote their case. We don't need to spend much time with them. Instead, I think that we should consider most of the folks in the in-between, like Enns and Collins and Moore and Kelly, who I believe you're reading this week, and Goldingay even. All of these people say something happened. There's a historical kernel that's underlying the story as it's retold in the book of Exodus. But precisely what happened and how it happened and when it happened and on what scope it happened, they would argue is much more difficult to say with certainty. And this, I think, is what will be really difficult for a lot of you to wrap your brains around. Most of these scholars, they conclude whatever happened, it's not exactly what we have in the Bible. You've got the archaeological issues, there's no evidence. And you've got the textual issues, there's no texts outside of the Bible that refer to this story. And you've got the logical issues, like we talked about last week, with the length of time that it would take a group of slaves, roughly the size of Baltimore, to march beyond any one fixed point, and how that doesn't really cohere with the depiction of the crossing of the Red Sea. It certainly doesn't cohere with your viewing of the Ten Commandments or the Prince of Egypt, those sorts of movies that are sort of ingrained into our way of thinking. But as Collins says, it seems more likely that some historical memories underlie the tradition of the Exodus. There's a historical kernel here. For example, the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15, it's an early text, probably the earliest text that we have in the Old Testament, and it celebrates a victory of this group of people over the Egyptians at the Red Sea. The name for Moses, it's got a ton of problems attached to it, but it has some Egyptian origins. As Collins notes, it's difficult to imagine why Israel would give such a prominent role to someone with an Egyptian name if that person didn't exist. I should also include the fact that this story is cited everywhere in the Bible. People keep coming back to the Exodus for hope, for comfort, for strength. They also tend to remind God what happened. They say things like, "Deliver us now," whatever their given circumstances are, "like you did back then." J. Clinton McCann actually refers to this as the God of the Exodus becomes the God of the Exoduses, which I love. That's such a beautiful turn of phrase. Goldingay concludes, the evidence for considering the historicity of the Exodus is limited. We don't have a lot. And he goes on to say, this is a situation that is unlikely to change. You probably won't find that headline that you want about the Egyptian chariot wheels being embedded and unearthed on the bottom of the Red Sea. So he goes on to conclude that there's always likely going to be varying options. I tend to throw in my cards with the in-betweeners. Something happened. But what exactly happened is hard, if not impossible, to say. Before we start to weigh in, I'd encourage you to come full circle here and think about what we are bringing with us to the interpretive process, namely the views that we have on history and history writing in the Bible. That's often what is driving the bus here, the expectations that we have of what our Bible is doing. Bill Arnold again writes, part of the difficulty is in assuming that the Old Testament intended to write history in our modern sense of the term. We have all of our ideas and we impose them back onto the text. He continues, the Exodus narrative is not such a pure historiography, but is more of a religious or theological treatise. A couple of things here. For Arnold, a historical happening definitely underlies the retelling of the Exodus as we have it in the Bible. But he says that what we have in the text is not pure history. That much is clear. That's his words. In fact, his preferred language for describing the biblical account of the Exodus is docudrama. I need you to get this. Bill Arnold is not a liberal scholar by any stretch of the imagination. He would not have his position at Asbury if he was. He is not, to my knowledge, against inerrancy even. He does not have a low view of the Bible. He's not this rogue, godless liberal that is seeking to take over a conservative seminary such as Asbury. What he is saying is more about how the ancients wrote history. It's not his rejection of the event or his rejection of the possibility of the supernatural or his rejection of miracles or the power of God to do these miracles. That's not what he's saying. He's saying the story is something other than objective history. It's shaped history. It's theologized history. Enns would say it's mythicized history. For Arnold, the genre category that we use to approach the story is massively important. And if we get it wrong, it will drastically impact how we view it.